Hello, everyone. Welcome to your newest episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast with your host, myself, Laura Matsu, and Bernhard Gunther. And in this episode, it's going to be a really in-depth episode, and we're going to go into the real causes of mental illness. So before we get into that, I just have a little announcement, and we are going to do a masterclass on evolutionary relationships. Registration is going to be open next week, and it's going to be about how to use relationships as a path of awakening. And we're going to give you tools on how to do that. We're going to give demonstrations. We're going to talk about different spiritual topics which are related to using relationships as a path of evolution. So if you want to be notified, make sure that you're on Bernhard's mailing list. So you would go to www.veilofreality.com and you'll see a little pop-up to sign up for his newsletter, and make sure you sign up because we're going to announce it next week. So what we're going to cover in this podcast is pretty vast. We're going to begin in the first hour. We're going to talk about how mental illness pretty much, in our opinion, only has one diagnosis. We're going to talk about the DSM, a brief history of the DSM. We're going to talk about how personality disorders are actually adaptations, meaning adaptations to an environment that someone was raised in. We're going to talk about what depression is related to and how it's related to trauma. And we're also going to talk about how this collective loss of the relationship of the divine is also related to the epidemic of mental unwellness, I guess you could say, that we're having, and how to heal from mental illness. So we're going to just give some practical tips looking at aspects of your health, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual. And in the second hour, we're going to talk about the history of psychiatry, and we're going to get more into the occult entity topic related to the mental illness. So we're going to talk about entity attachments, earthbound spirits, how that relates to mental illness. We're going to go into Dr. William Baldwin's work on this as well as Jerry Marcinski, and really just kind of talk about how the spiritual, like hidden dimension, can be related to mental illness as well. But before we get into it, I just have to do a quick disclaimer. Bernhard and I are not medical professionals, and we are not giving any medical advice on this podcast. So we're just going to speak from our own experience in hopes that we can present a different view on mental illness than the consensus view. I'm sure some of this information may not be new to some of you, but for some of you who maybe are on psychiatric drugs or have been diagnosed with a mental illness, I just want you to know that, we're not telling you to get off your medication. We're not telling you that it's all in your head or whatever. We're just presenting a different perspective to mental illness based on our own experiences struggling with it. So just a disclaimer, not medical advice. Just take this as information, knowledge. It's an opinion. It's personal opinion. And that's it. So where should we begin?
Well, let's start with the big news, which really, was the inspiration for this podcast. Well, big news happened a few weeks ago, I would say, maybe a month ago. And it's about the depression serotonin myth and chemical imbalance, or linking depression to chemical imbalance in the brain, which has been basically the consensus view on, mainstream psychiatry, so to speak, that mental illness, and in particular depression, is related to a chemical imbalance in the brain. Hence, you treat it with SSRIs or antidepressants. What does SSRI stand for again, by the way?
Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor.
Very good. You know that very well. However, there has been some research coming out, official research, a few weeks ago on various articles, basically stating that the official science that depression is linked to a chemical imbalance in the brain has been officially debunked. And there's even a quote from an official science paper stating that depression is not caused by chemical imbalance in the brain, new study finds. And the direct quote from this study is, just to basically summarize it in a nutshell, quote, "Despite the fact that the serotonin theory of depression has been so influential, no comprehensive review has yet synthesized the relevant evidence. which is huge. So basically,
where's that from again?
That's from an official government paper. You linked to it actually.
It was from the study then.
From the study,
yeah,
exactly.
Got it. Yeah,
because you made a little video, I think, on Instagram about
yes,
this
exactly.
topic, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We can link to that. I'm going to link to that article in the show notes of this episode as well, so you guys can check it out. But basically, it's been proving, which I want to go later, what Jerry Masinski talked about in a podcast many years ago, that there has been never, ever a scientific proof linking chemical imbalance to depression. And now it's been confirmed, so to speak. And we have assumed that for so long.
Yeah.
Right? So that's what I want to start off, that actually that's a huge step, right? That officially it's acknowledged that depression most likely does not link to any chemical imbalance. Hence the question of antidepressants, antipsychotic drugs, and all of that.
Well, no, but so this is just related to SSRIs.
Right.
Like the antipsychotics that they give them is based on also bunk science that hasn't ever been proven as well, which is antipsychotics are usually more given to people with schizophrenia or even borderline sometimes. Sometimes they can give them people with depression as well. But that the science behind that is also bunk, basically.
Right. Okay. All of it. We know that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, there was never really scientific proof for the connection of depression and chemical imbalance to begin with, but it was based on big pharma sponsored pseudoscience. Why? Because just follow the money as always and question who really profits in generally from SSRIs and other psychotic drugs. On that note, the pharmaceutical industry, little fact here, is making about $11.7 billion a year on the sale of psychotropic drugs basically, and 1 out of 6 Americans is on some kind of psychotropic drug.
I guarantee you it's higher than that.
Yeah,
I think it's higher because even I was reading a statistic the other day that like 15% of children in foster care under 5 were on an antipsychotic.
Oh wow, okay. I think it's also increased, especially as we talked on this podcast a few times over the past couple of years, with this Matrix trauma installment program and basically psychological warfare, military style MK Ultra program, with all the lockdowns and gaslighting and basically traumatizing the whole population. More and more people got on these drugs, and because of the mental breakdowns.
Well, it's not just that. It's been happening for a while, Like I actually read that 50% of Americans were on some level of psychiatric drugs. So, we've been medicalizing human suffering for the past few decades. When is the psychiatry, the DSM started?
That started in 1952.
Okay, exactly. So this is pretty young, and personally, I think it was a huge mistake, and there's many reasons behind that.
I don't think it was a mistake, was it?
No, I mean,
intentionally.
Yeah, intentionally. Okay, so in the eyes of the divine, there are no mistakes, but this was basically, when I say mistake, this did not help the problem. It actually made it worse, and it actually made society worse. That's my hypothesis.
Yeah, it's profited the pharmaceutical industry,
Yes.
All of that. So of course, a big part of the pharmaceutical industry and psychiatry is the so-called DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Some people call it also the psychiatry's Bible, the diagnostic Bible that nobody questions, and people just read it, and or even people who go and study psychiatry, become psychiatrists, they take the information in without ever questioning where it's coming from. And it's really fascinating because, a lot of these labels or mental illnesses that are described in the DSM are literally made up based on very unscientific methods. And people just observed, we're going to call this that, we're going to call this bipolar, we're going to call this borderline personality.
Yes.
Many personality disorders, right?
So
people just make up. And also then basically believing that for the most part, mental illness is also caused because of a chemical imbalance in the brain, which then can be helped via pharmaceutical drugs.
So they made it all up, and it was basically a group of psychiatrists who were basically hypothesizing about the personality patterns that they saw in their clients, and they just invented illnesses out of it, basically. So,
Yes.
and actually, I don't even think the scientific method itself can get at the mental illness on top of it, because I see it as actually has a spiritual dimension, you know. But okay, so let me give a quote about this directly from the book Cracked by James Davies. And this is a really good book. It talks about the history of psychiatry. The subtitle is called The Unhappy Truth About Psychiatry. And basically, you know, he gives this quote from Dr. Theodore Millon, who was part of the original DSM construction. And here's what he said about it. This is directly from someone who was on the original task force of the DSM.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, there was very little systematic research, and much of the research that existed was really a hodgepodge, scattered, inconsistent, and ambiguous. I think the majority of us recognize that the amount of good, solid science upon which we were making our decisions was pretty modest. So that's one quote.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, once I read this quote to Spitzer, who was one of the main leaders on the task force, and this guy, James Davy, asked whether he agreed with Milton's statement. And he says, after a short and uncomfortable silence, Spitzer responded in a way I didn't expect. So this is Spitzer, one of the main people behind the original DSM. And he says, well, it's true that for many of the disorders that were added, there wasn't a tremendous amount of research. And certainly there wasn't research on the particular way that we define these disorders. In the case of Million's quote, which is a quote I just gave you, I think he is mainly referring to the personality disorders. But again, it is certainly true that the amount of research validating data on most psychiatric disorders is very limited indeed. And then the guy who's interviewing says, so you're saying, I asked, trying not to look shocked, that there was little research not only supporting your inclusion of new disorders, but also supporting how these disorders should be defined. And then Spitzer says, there are very few disorders whose definition was the result of specific research data, responded Spitzer. For borderline personality, there was some research that looked at the different ways of defining the disorder. And we chose that definition that seemed to be the most valid. But for the other categories, rarely could you say that there was research literature supporting the definition's validity. So basically, and he goes on later to say, yeah, we had very little in the way of data, so we were forced to rely on clinical consensus, which admittedly, in his own words, is a very poor way to do things. And he said, basically, and then the guy asked him, how was the consensus reached? And he says, we thrashed it out, basically. We had a 3-hour argument. There would be 12 people sitting down at a table. Usually there was a chairperson, there was somebody taking notes. And at the end of each meeting, there would be a distribution of events. And at the next meeting, some would agree with the inclusion and others would continue arguing. And if people were divided, the matter would eventually be decided by a vote. And so this is like, literally, it was just 12 people in a room just having a discussion about how they could invent different mental illnesses based on what they saw in their practice. And I'm sure they were also kind of defining certain groups of personality adaptations and traits. I'm not saying that it was all nonsense. Like, these are people who are working with people who are mentally ill. But it's really important to understand there's no scientific basis for this.
So it confirms basically what I've talked about, and Jeremy Sinskiewicz will talk about more his work also in the second hour, because he also ties into mental illness to entity attachments and the real cause of schizophrenia and all of that. I had him on my podcast. But basically that the DSM, which is the Psychiatry's Bible of Mental Illness, is literally a work of fiction, where also important to understand these psychiatrists are materialists, right? So it's all about the brain. So there's no spiritual aspect, nothing even talking about trauma and all of that. And they literally just made up labels, as you said, based on very unscientific methods.
Yeah.
Now, interesting. Here, another fact, also these fabricated so-called mental disorders continue to grow. So it's the DSM-1, the first edition came out in 1952, and it listed 106 psychiatric disorders. And now, fast forward, DSM-5 came out, the most current one, 2013, and it lists 297 disorders. So
Yeah.
that's like a increase of 3 times, and they keep adding
Yes.
and more disorders, even like all kinds of. I even remember a few years ago, some sort of disorder, like they have. I should have looked it up, but I forgot to do it. Kind of targeting truth seekers, right? If you believe in conspiracies, there's a certain mental disorder you have because you don't listen to authority and the consensus. So they just keep up making up shit, my friends, as they go along. Now, on top of it, obviously, since 1952, the pharmaceutical industry has more and more influence into this diagnostic way of adding personality disorders in the DSM as well, because the pharmaceutical industry is very powerful, lobbying, people cashing in. And I remember even, it's somewhat related working at an animal hospital, because they give animals the same drugs they give humans, just in lower doses. And maybe, it's very fascinating.
They give them psychiatric drugs.
They give them psychiatric drugs. And it was fascinating to see that they were even giving dogs Prozac.
Yeah.
Because they seem sad or like not really active. So they assume that dogs are depressed, have a depression, and give them Prozac. And Prozac is very interesting because that was probably the very first antidepressant drug that came on the market. Excuse me. And it was first came on the market in 1988. And that's also when the drug company Eli Lilly, who produced Prozac and announced in 1988, first advanced the chemical imbalance theory. So that's when it really took a hold.
Yeah. So can we go into the trauma piece about it? Because I really want to talk about, okay, so then if, we're not denying the fact that people are mentally unwell. I can see it all the time on social media, even in the world, we're not denying the fact that there isn't something happening in the collective psyche of most westernized people, which is pretty much the whole world at this point. But my personal belief about that is that all of these diagnoses have one diagnosis. Well, okay, when you bring in the occult topic, I just want to say there's a caveat to this. But for most people who are experiencing personality disorders, there's one diagnosis, and that's trauma, basically. It goes across the board. And I'm going to read a quote by Gabor Mate about this, where he really sums it up perfectly. And then I'm going to talk about how this is true, how I feel this is true. So he has a great quote, and he says, all of these medical conditions originate in trauma. All the diagnoses that you deal with, depression, anxiety, ADHD, bipolar, even psychosis, are significantly rooted in trauma. They are manifestations of trauma, and therefore the diagnoses don't explain anything. Now, the problem in the medical world is that we diagnose somebody and we think that that is an explanation. He's behaving that way because he's psychotic. She's behaving that way because she has ADHD. But nobody has ADHD. Nobody has psychosis. These are processes within the individual. It's not a thing you have. It's not like you acquire a bacterial infection and now you have pneumonia. This is a process that explains your life experience, and it has meaning in every single case. The diagnoses never get at the meaning. What they do is what the diagnoses do is they describe something. In other words, they describe the manifestations of something. For example, take a diagnosis like borderline personality disorder. She's like that because she has BPD. No, she's not like that because she has BPD. BPD just describes her coping mechanism.
BPD stands for borderline personality disorder.
Yes, exactly. So what I'm saying to you, that all diagnoses originate in coping mechanisms.
So basically, in a nutshell, they mistake symptoms for causes.
Exactly. And you want to look, instead of thinking what's wrong with you, what's wrong with your brain, you just have a permanent issue with your brain. That's this pathologization of these processes. You want to ask what happened to the person that could have made them develop this coping mechanism.
Yeah. The only thing I would object, and that's definitely, I agree with Gabor Mate, but there are also instances, and that's more the minority, which goes, more into the occult topic, because sometimes these disorders can definitely relate more to earthbound spirit entity attachments, which we could talk later in the second hour. But trauma also serves as an entry point, and then kind of
exactly. So it's still related
on some level. But they also, but I also want to say, from an occult perspective, Sri Aurobindo talked about it, Rudolf Steiner in his own work as well. There are also people born without a conscience, and ties into genetic psychopaths and not necessarily related to any childhood trauma.
Yes.
But this is a small minority.
Yeah, so I want to make that a point because this is a very small minority, but we're going to cover it because that's been our work, is looking at the occult spiritual influence. One thing we're probably not going to have time to touch on this topic as well is that when you get into evolutionary astrology, there is mental, spiritual, and emotional, psychological trauma that can be re-imprinted from past lifetimes. So for example, if you were abandoned as a child in a past life, and then your parents kind of left you at your grandparents one day and you didn't know when they were going to come back, even though it's not you being totally abandoned by your family and you never see them again, that can re-imprint the past life trauma in this lifetime.
Yes.
So we want, you can, I personally, blow this whole thing that it's even happening in the brain out of the water. I don't think it's happening. I think also the soul can get traumatized as well. So, my view goes, and similar to yours, even goes beyond Gabor Mate's, because I think that there's dimensions, spiritual dimensions to trauma, soul fragmentation, even, I think the soul can get traumatized as well through certain really intense life experiences, and people can come in with that trauma as well. So we're just going to look at it from the developmental trauma perspective, and then we can touch on the occult aspect in the second hour.
Yeah, also I want to just point out, because we've touched on it in the second hour, but the reason also I want to be very clear, in my work, I talk a lot about hyperdimensional realities, entities, the hyperdimensional manipulation of humanity, unseen forces and whatnot, finding good, the occult knowledge, the hidden knowledge, and other forces interfering with the human evolution. But the reason why we really focus also now specifically on trauma work, shadow work, and all of that complex PTSD is so key. And also, I agree with you, past life trauma can be reactivated in the current life. But the reason you focus, because that's also most often the entry point for all other stuff coming in. And I've noticed in this work, people jump most often to this whole entity topic way too prematurely, not knowing their own mind, never really sincerely engaged in trauma work or shadow work, and make all kinds of assumptions. But more on that in the second hour.
Well, I'll speak to that piece. The reason why that's important is because trauma infamously will either put you in a state of hypervigilance, fight or flight, or even freeze, a state of disassociation. So if you're in that state, you're going to see all sorts of dangerous stuff everywhere all the time, because that's how your nervous system is wired. So you can't even actually be in a grounded enough state to tell if it's a spiritual interference until you're actually regulated yourself, is what I'm trying to say. So it's like you have to work with the body and the nervous system that you have, get yourself into a safe and secure place yourself, and then you can work with it. But I mean, there's a reason that complex trauma is called complex, because it is complicated to heal. It's not like you just, I'm just going to meditate and do some vagal nerve toning and I'm fine. It's literally a rewiring of these survival adaptations that your nervous system learned actually kept you safe. So there's a reason why people, the processes in borderline personality and schizophrenia, of manic depression, whatever you want to call it, all describe a coping mechanism that was an adaptation to some relational experience. That's my feeling about it.
So going back to DSM and Gabor Mate's quote. So basically saying, just to summarize it, all these personality disorders and symptoms, be it, even borderline personality disorder, ADHD, anxiety, like whatever they name as a mental illness, has their symptoms, has its roots in trauma, most often originating in childhood.
Yes, and the DSM actually even rejected adding developmental trauma disorder to it, because they even said themselves that the symptoms of developmental trauma overlap too much with other personality disorders. So in their own words, they actually said we can't add this because it's going to get rid of all the other definitions. So it's like,
it interferes with our work.
Exactly. It interferes with us expanding our, So I want to just give some quotes from Healing Developmental Trauma by Lawrence Heiler. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing
Can we just maybe just define developmental trauma?
I'm going to do that. Yeah, I'm going to do that. Yeah, exactly.
Perfect.
Exactly. So basically C-PTSD, which is complex PTSD, this is a quote from Healing Developmental Trauma. It's being used as a catch-all for both ongoing interpersonal trauma for children and adults and the impacts of childhood trauma on adults. So CPSD particular focus on affects 3 areas of life. Self-organization, meaning the way that you connect and relate to yourself, emotional regulation, self-concept, and relationships. Whereas developmental trauma in particular is basically based on relational disruptions during childhood that affect the child's sense of self. Complex trauma is an umbrella term that includes basically later relational disruptions to one's sense of self. So the developmental trauma happens very young in your developmental years, basically. And then complex trauma would be ongoing trauma that can actually kind of link up with that. So if you have developmental trauma, chances are you've also experienced complex trauma later on, because your developmental trauma would most likely actually make you seek out situations that would create more trauma for you later on. And also it's really important to understand that the field of complex trauma is basically related to attachment theory. So it's about how attachment relationships impact child development. So we want to look at that. And that's ongoing too, So disorganized attachment, for example, is highly linked with BPD, for example. So attachment theory, complex PTSD are really highly interlinked, essentially. And so, it was really a long time before they even put PTSD into the DSM itself. It was a long time before they even allowed that to go in, because the mainstream medical model tended to deny trauma for a really long time. And if you look at the child rearing practices, even in the 50s, like let the baby cry it out, we had all of these kind of basically pathological ways of raising children based on the medicalization of birth, essentially. So, it was a really big shift when they actually put PTSD into the DSM. And by the way, complex PTSD is, I don't believe is in the DSM anymore. And then Judith Herman has a really good quote about this, where she defines it. And she wrote this book, trauma book. Sorry, the name is not in my mind right now, but she has this great quote where she says, "The diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder does not fit accurately enough in survivors of prolonged repeated trauma. The symptom picture is often far more complex. Survivors of abuse in childhood develop characteristic personality changes, including deformations of relatedness and identity. In addition, they are particularly vulnerable to repeated harm, both self-inflicted and at the hands of others. The syndrome that follows upon prolonged, repeated trauma needs its own name. I propose to call it complex post-traumatic stress." So complex post-traumatic stress is basically long-term exposure to relational and emotional trauma in which you didn't have any control to escape from, for no self-agency, meaning your parents, basically. So when your parents are not meeting your needs and not attuned to, or even worse, they're abused, you have a family member who's addicted, who has a mental illness, the child actually tends to disconnect from themselves in order to adapt to the environment. So that's the first trauma that happens. Any moment where you were forced to disconnect from your own feelings, your own self, in order to adapt to an unhealthy environment, that is developmental trauma.
Yeah, on that note, I would even argue or say, I've written about this before as well, that there is no such thing as mental illness. Nobody's mentally ill. These are coping mechanisms, trauma responses, symptoms, right? There's nothing wrong in your brain other than, and even like what you just mentioned, some of these trauma responses we have, even we talked about in a previous podcast, like the fight and flight, freeze and fawn, disassociating, or even other behaviors because of the PTSD, were very necessary at that moment of the trauma to protect ourselves.
Exactly.
So we need to understand there's nothing wrong with these reactions because they help us survive.
Yes.
Right? The fight and flight, the disassociating, it was not, we needed to escape in the head, disassociate, it was not safe to share our feelings, our emotions and whatnot. Right? So these are valid reactions of the mind to disassociate, to protect ourselves on a psychological, emotional, even physical level. The only problem is with complex PTSD, it stays within, and we then unconsciously have these reactions to even safe situations in the future, and it becomes more embedded in the psyche. But it's not a mental illness.
No. Like it's like a survival-based personality adaptation that served you well in some environment. And keep in mind that it can happen beyond early childhood. It can be you have like a terrible relationship, but if you're attracted to terrible relationships, it's also related to developmental trauma. So they overlap a lot, you know. Yeah. But the issue is the focus on the symptoms and the behavior. It doesn't look at the underlying cause and why this happened. So there's a reason why anyone developed any negative self-concept, negative relationship traits. It all serves a purpose. But then later on, it's like this outdated program that keeps running, you know. So for example, you know, for people who have had, loss of trust or abusive childhoods or whatever, you know, they learn not to trust early on because, of course, like they learn not to trust because the adults around them were not reliable or safe. But then later on, they will not trust anyone in life, even if that person has proven to be trustworthy, because that adaptation is still running.
And then, you know, not trusting yourself and not trusting life and living this perpetual fear.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And paranoia.
Yeah. So we really want to understand complex trauma. And we want to understand the adaptations, you know, and it's really important to understand C-PTSD. So complex PTSD basically focuses on impairments on the ability to regulate your emotions. So it's about dysregulation. So you want to understand, you know, how, you know, basically how triggered you get in everyday life, essentially. So you want to look at like how your nervous system gets activated in certain situations, how you tend to check out, how you tend to freeze. Also, you know, issues with self-regulation tends to lead with issues with eating, sleeping, sexuality, impulse control. How it shows up is depression, anxiety, numbing, pain, difficulty relating to the world, difficulty relating to, authorities or whatever. There's so many ways it shows up, but basically it's a disconnection from the self and it is disconnection from healthy attachment, essentially. So, you know, it's really important. We have to first understand, how did this person in front of us, how did I adapt to this relational trauma? What are the impacts of the adaptations on my nervous system, on my disconnection from self, on my disconnection from relationships, and how actually the suffering underlying all of these adaptations is really a deep desire for connection. Okay, so that's kind of what where the healing comes from. And just to kind of like riff a little bit, you know, so borderline personality is basically highly related to disorganized attachment. I hate you, but don't leave me kind of thing. That's disorganized attachment. Manic depression, for example, is issues regulating emotions. And I can speak from personal experience. So I lived in an environment that was very emotionally chaotic, like either it was amazing or it was awful. And so I was later diagnosed with manic depression. And where did I learn to have such dysregulated emotions? I learned it from my early childhood environment. And then schizophrenia is actually extreme splitting, basically. So the psyche literally splits and enters into a different world. So we'll talk about that more in the second hour. But it's really important that we understand, basically, instead of what's wrong with you, what happened to you. And we want to look at how any symptoms that they diagnose as mental illnesses are basically survival strategies that we learn to deal with unresolved trauma. And people are really doing the best they can given the circumstances that they grew up in. So it really actually removes this pathologization and medicalization of mental illness. And instead, it looks at like, what kind of personality adaptations does this person have? How could that help them survive early on? And how can we get them back into a safe and connected space within themselves and within their relationships?
Yeah, you make a good point. I want to also especially nowadays, these personality disorders are being thrown around. Even in the quote truth movement, conscious movement, people like just use it to insult people. Even like Amber Heard, for example. I mean, this is a mainstream thing. She got diagnosed with BPD, borderline personality disorder. She exhibits all the symptoms, probably has been lying all around. But she also exhibits this attachment issue,
disorganized attachment.
It's so clear. And it's all the signs point into that also. These are symptoms based on trauma, right?
Yes.
But then people, shadow project on her, it really insult her in many different ways. And I'm not saying that people need to be not held accountable for whatever they did wrong and whatnot, but there's some deeper issue. And I can relate to that as well, because I've been in a relationship many, many years ago with somebody who got diagnosed with BPD, right? But I can see underlying there was a lot of trauma she had in childhood early on that developed that personality. So the problem we have right now with the DSM is that they pathologize these processes. And I understand there's also the need for the human mind to categorize, to label for language, right? So sometimes I'm using also like an NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, or borderline personality disorder, all these, like, you can use them, in the terms of to label.
They're archetypes at this point.
They're almost archetypes, but understanding they are coping mechanisms based on trauma for the most part.
Yeah, which automatically should bring you to a more compassionate framework to your own. If you've been diagnosed with a mental illness, if you know someone with a mental illness, it doesn't mean that you don't make boundaries or you make excuses for their behavior, I also think that there's been this whole wave of like people destigmatizing mental illness. But the issue with that is in the destigmatization, they've overly identified with the mental illness. So like, I'm BPD, I'm this and this and this. And they literally take it as a badge of honor, And so we have almost the opposite direction of people, we've quote unquote destigmatized mental illness according to the consensus, but then along with it we've made people overly identify with the mental illness and see it as a life sentence.
Exactly. The identification with the label is also the trap with itself, or using it as a weapon. You've seen many people even like they blame their partner, like, oh, she's a BPD, or he's a narcissist.
Yes.
Right. The demonizing of the partner, getting yourself in the victim consciousness, and not like having compassion in that sense. Having compassion for the trauma, what's underlying it, right? Doesn't mean that you don't make boundaries, doesn't mean that you don't, just go along with it. But also then self-reflecting, how come, especially in a relationship, you were attracted to this person to begin with, or why did you attract this person into your life to begin with as well? Because a lot of relationships we engage in are based on unconscious attraction, based on unconscious trauma, there's a lot of trauma bonding.
Yes, exactly. So let's talk a little bit particularly about depression because I think that's probably the most common thing. I think it's also personally, it's part of the human condition. Is it okay we move on to this?
Yeah.
So I want to first start by giving a definition about the depressive position, which is from Melanie Klein. Okay, so she talks about an important stage in the child's development, which includes the depressive position. So the depressive position is basically a mental constellation that she defines as first experienced in the first year of the child's life. And it's repeatedly revisited throughout childhood and adulthood. So it's central to this realization is when the child realizes that the mother is an object of love and also an object of hate. So it's this confluence of the thing that I love is also not, the thing that I hate, the thing that gives me anxiety, creates basically this paradox within the child. And then that's used in different ways in later development, basically. So basically, and now I'm quoting Mark Jones, who's actually one of my mentors in psychosynthesis, where he talks about that the maturation of the adult also includes this depressive position and the ability to handle paradox. So any deeper human love has to include the depressive position. So this is when you realize that the person you love is also a source of pain for you. So it's almost like the acknowledgement of basic suffering in Buddhism. It means that you realize that you can't depend on being happy from someone else, basically, that people are not there to meet your narcissistic needs. So as soon as we see the world as all good or all bad, we're in this position of psychic splitting, and we're not accepting the maturity of the depressive position. So basically, and this is Mark Jones' quote, he says, to individuate, you actually have to accept the depressive position. So you have to accept that your parents were not the best in the world. Maybe they could have been better, but they weren't. You have to accept that people are not all good or all bad, but often a little bit of both, and that no one will magically rescue you from your pain that life includes. So life includes suffering, it includes paradox, and it's hard. So this is a maturation process that depression represents. So accepting this depressive position and being mature with it is the point of depression. So there's implicit maturation associated with depression. There's a reason that Saturn in astrology represents depression and maturation. And it's about recognizing that no one's going to save me from this. Being human is hard. It's all on me. And there's pain in that. And that will liberate you from life. But accepting that depression as part of life is actually part of a healthy ego.
Yeah, I can relate to that. So there's also, again, depression is part of life. It's actually a function of the psyche, so to speak, in the maturation process of the soul as well. The individuation process ties into maximum alienation, maximum, what is the other one? Isolation,
yeah.
Right? But I want to share this from my own experience because I can see it twofold, because I was definitely dealing with severe depression, despair and suicidal tendencies, especially in my early 20s, throughout my 20s, really. That really also, that depression actually was the catalyst that got me into the work I'm doing right now, questioning what's going on in the world, who am I, because I really had to figure myself out. Otherwise I would have died. That's really the voice that came into my mind. I was, dealing with a lot of free states. I realize now that the depression I was dealing with was also a trauma response.
It's a free state, right?
A free state.
Yes, that's another piece yeah, exactly.
Depression is the free state, right? In this sense.
Yeah, because you're so frozen. Like, you have to understand that underneath depression is anger. So you need to actually, the depression is like almost like a state of activation that's gone on so long that you're now frozen in this state of suppression.
Because I can relate that, because there have been phases when I was just laying in fetus position in bed, just crying, not having no energy, no motivation, no life force, nothing. I was just
exactly.
Also was loathing, self-loathing, right?
Yes.
Like really, poor me kind of thing.
Yeah.
So all of that. Now knowing what I know about my own history, going deeper into my own psyche and widening my perspective, a lot of it was a trauma response in a sense, right? Of missing certain developmental needs that were not met, you know, growing up and all of that, right?
What age did it happen to you?
The depression?
Yeah.
That was in my early 20s.
Okay, yeah. So
up,
do you
up
think
to my Saturn return.
Do you think it was actually also, can you see it being part of like maturing into adulthood too, and having to accept the crappiness of life too?
Exactly. So that's I came to realize. So in my whole process, I could see it partly trauma response, but also I realized that the depression, especially I was dealing with, and many others maybe as well, or even quote unquote other psychological issues people are being labeled with, are in fact sometimes I see as a normal reaction to growing up in a society that's very much removed from nature and spirit.
Exactly.
You know, the quote came to mind. What really helped me in this process, and I've mentioned this quote many times, but it had a profound effect in my life when I first came across it in the 90s. It's by Krishnamurti, you know, and he's saying it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And that's what I was trying to do. I was comparing myself to society. I was trying to fit in, but it brought more depression. It didn't fit. It was like a contradiction. And that's where the depression came from, right? So I saw it almost now. I realized that depression in that sense is a healthy sign of a healthy spiritual immune system to reject the pathogen of culture and influences of a society where pathologies have become normalized.
Well, that's kind of like the Mark Jones, you know, to individuate, you have to have accepted the depressive position. And this is actually probably the main issue that I have with a lot of the people in the spiritual community, because, or maybe not the spiritual community I'm in, but the kind of like new age love and light crew, you know, because they don't accept the depressive position. Like, oh, it's all love, it's all one, and whatever. It's like, no, life is hard sometimes. Life includes suffering. Like, I'm with the Buddhists on this, you know. If you accept that, actually, the easier life will get. But if you live in this state of psychological splitting where life is either all good or all bad, people are either good or all bad, you've not accepted the basic depression, the basic suffering of life, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And this process became also very clear to me. The depression had nothing to do with a chemical imbalance in my brain. If I would have gone back then to a psychiatrist, they would have put me on some sort of SSRI, an antidepressant.
Yes.
Right? But for me, depression was, for the most part, it's like a cry or call from the soul or spirit begging for attention.
Yeah.
Right? That's really what I realized. And the only way out was in and through. So I also learned only on to allow myself. I mean, I had my phase of self-indulgence, listening to very depressive music or, Alice in Chains and
But
whatnot.
how was that helping you?
In two ways. It was helping me on some level. I could relate, on an emotional level. Especially music allowed me myself to feel those feelings. That was a key point.
Yeah, can I say something to that though? That's really important, because in order to actually get out of the depression, you actually have to slowly pendulate between allowing yourself to feel the more intense feelings, including anger, including the grief. And you have to and the music actually helped you get out of the depression because it helped you get out of the freeze state through processing the emotions.
Exactly. Well, thank you for sharing. And then also being a musician, expressing myself, playing in bands, drums, expressing that creatively helped me a lot. Also dance. So that was my, especially drumming, to really like process these emotions, and listening music has a big effect on it. The other side of the coin though, is I saw myself also sometimes, especially, that's the emo thing. I was never into emo, but more into like grunge. I grew up on Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, more heavier music as well, Metallica, Pantera. But I could bury myself emotionally. But I saw myself then also indulging in it and kind of getting stuck in it, right? Almost identifying more with that state.
So can I just ask you, applying trauma theory, did you just pendulate like into the bad feelings and not kind of pendulate into feelings of neutrality or relief? Because that would be the ideal trauma healing. So you would go into the intense death metal or, the music to help you process the feelings, but then you would go out of it into either a state of neutral feeling or a state of neutrality, and that would help you process the emotions.
That's very good question. I can see both. Sometimes getting stuck in it and more indulging in it.
Yeah, so you were pendulating. Yeah.
But then also helping to transmute it, and I feel actually relieved and lighter.
Yes.
Like really processing it.
Yes.
But the key point, what helped me in this process as well, because a lot of the bands I liked then, they died of drug overdoses, they killed themselves, they kind of got stuck in all of that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But what helped me then was also doing the psychological work, that, my own child, confronting that, but bringing in the spiritual aspect, which is very key. Like, that's what I want to address as well, because only the psychological process, fine and good, but you can always get stuck in childhood, of digging in psychoanalysis, which can be a trap in itself. If you don't bring the spiritual aspect, not only aspiration to the divine, but to essence, to your true self, the ultimate questions, who am I beyond this personality?
Well, that's the whole, I think, issue, is that we have removed spirit, we have removed the sacred from part of the consensus reality, because we are in this materialistic age. And that's actually what's causing a lot of this mental illness, I think. That's the underlying thing, is if you remove what connects people to all of life, then and their relationship with a higher power, then you actually remove the main reason why we're here, essentially,
Yeah, on that note as well, even I can see it in you and being both together. Even to this day, I still have sometimes, I'm depressed here in little things, melancholic stuff comes up. Is the ascent and descent? I'm not always like happy, love and light and like motivated. Sometimes I go down in depth into the cave, into the underworld myself, and I feel even what's happening in the world, it gets to me and all of that. But I've learned to transmute it, to sit with it, be with it, and even and get inspired by it creatively.
Yeah.
Right. That a lot of my work is based on, pain and suffering, to kind of find the solution, to find my way out of it through these processes, through understanding, and kind of use it as a motivation, in a sense, to embrace life more.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. So let's just talk about, we're not going to give people answers on how to get off psychiatric drugs or whatever, but I'm just going to speak from my own experience, how I helped myself heal from major mental illness and trauma. And I'm still working on it now. I still have exaggerated startle responses if someone like sneaks up on me or something. You know, there's still leftover signs. So I just want people to know that healing trauma is a marathon. It's not a race. In fact, if you make it into a race, you're going to add another layer of trauma on top of your already agitated nervous system. So let's look at some pieces, and then I want to hear how you related to this too. Okay, so first, you really have to look at all aspects of your health. So this is going to begin with the physical. So if you were on psychiatric drugs, other drugs, etc., you know, I know Kelly Brogan actually has a detox protocol from psychiatric drugs. If people want to look into that as well, she has a whole program that she helps people taper off, you know. But regardless, so if you're wanting to, you have to get your body in shape, especially if you were using psychiatric drugs. Like that's what I had to do. I had to detox. I was going hard. Every day I was detoxing. I'm not even joking. You have to stay away from processed food. You have to stay away from seed oils. You have to get daily exercise. You have to sweat, meditation, you know, all of the aspects of your physical health need to be, I think, basically almost like pristine. You know, you don't want to go into like some weird paranoid orthorexia thing as well, but you really got to clean up and detox your body. That's the first step. Because actually I notice a lot of people who have especially more severe mental illnesses, they have terrible diets as well, you know, and they're also probably attracted to these toxic foods because of the toxicity in their body too. So do not discount the physical environment and your physical health. Even maybe look at your house. You know, a lot of people are dealing with mold in their houses these days and environmental toxins they're not even aware of, you know. So it's really good for even the healthy individual to really, you know, have a good diet, to detox regularly, looking at that aspect. And then emotional, you know, and psychological, I'll just kind of group those together. Understand trauma, psychoeducate yourself in trauma, get a trauma therapist who you really like and feel a connection with. You know, ultimately healing from trauma should result in a good, so you'll know that you're kind of somewhat more healed from trauma is if you have a good self-concept and you're able to have secure relationships with other people. That's kind of the barometer. So it's not like a endless thing, you know, but you want to have a good self-concept. Do I like myself? Do I have good self-esteem? And I'm able to feel connected to other people? Do I have secure attachment in my life? It's called earned secure attachment. So that's kind of the barometer, but you're going to have to really start out like really understanding your nervous system, understanding your adaptations, understanding what could have happened to you that created these adaptations, you know, and really just move away from making yourself to be wrong and I'm a bad person. Like any relational issue and ongoing pattern that you have, you learned from somewhere. So you want to really understand like, wow, interesting that I shut down whenever someone opens up to me. Where could that be coming from? How could that I've learned about that? And almost like become really curious. And I do really recommend, you know, working with a therapist and a trauma, especially one who understands developmental trauma and trauma in general, who can help you understand how attachment, you know, your attachment patterns basically. And then there is a spiritual, you know, like meditation has been proven to shrink the amygdala, which is something that tends to enlarge as a result of trauma. So you want to figure out some mind-body practice to just basically get you into a parasympathetic state, a calm and relaxed state. That's not a cure-all. Like all of these need to happen at once, you know? And that's why actually I think that many people would rather just take a pill, and many people don't accept the depressive position. They're like, I just want someone to come in and fix it, you know? But the reward that you get out of doing it the holistic way actually is that you just like, it's like you literally feel like you have a superpower. Like I really feel that people who heal trauma in themselves holistically have a superpower, because it's almost like they faced like a certain like death of the soul, you know, and they basically did a soul retrieval on themselves, you know. But not to say that they didn't have support, but like it does give you this kind of psychological, emotional, spiritual rebirth when you heal from really complex trauma, you know? And so it's really important that we understand it's not easy. It's a marathon, not a race. Find support systems that help you develop secure attachment, who understand attachment theory, who understand trauma. And really don't underestimate the importance of your health. Like it's so, so, so critical and key. I know a lot of people who are on very restrictive diets who actually start developing anxiety and mood disorders because of their diet. So you really want to find a diet that makes you feel strong, calm, healthy, like really vital and vibrant. So those are just a few things.
Yeah, basically you summarized what we also call, even we do this in our courses, the fourfold approach of holistic integral self-work on all levels: physically, psychologically, mentally, and spiritually, right? It needs to happen on all levels. And the only way out is in and through. And you made a good point. It's also on a deeper esoteric spiritual level lessons, whatever we don't heal or learn, we will have to face at some point in the future life. And just suppressing, avoiding it is not learning it, right? So we just, basically avoid the inevitable. Yeah. And also I have to say, which I'll go deep in the second hour now, the pharmaceutical drugs have also spiritual, metaphysical repercussions on a soul, detrimentally effects that can also affect the afterlife of future incarnations. So, and that also ties into the matrix control system on a more the occult reason why they're pushing pharmaceuticals on the population in light of the matrix control system. So I want to dive deep into all of that in the second hour.
Yeah, I just want to end this too, for anyone who's listening, that I really truly believe that all mental illness is basically curable, even schizophrenia, which people, the psychiatric industry is like just thinks is a mystery. So, to understand that the power is really in our hands and we are in this real paradigm shift of health, and we really need to get out of this pathologization, this medicalization of mental illness and thinking it's just a chemical imbalance in the brain and we can't fix it. That's all wrong.
Yeah, even getting away from the idea that it's, like I mentioned earlier, that it's a mental illness.
Yes.
Right?
It's a process.
It's a process. And, what is I see a lot of, I think Adyashanti said some way, a lot of people, they go along with the consensus or matrix. You could, from a spiritual perspective, you could see them as mentally and spiritually ill, right?
Yeah.
The personality, ego identification, all of that. So it's also what level you perceive it from.
Yes. So we can go deeper into that in the second hour. And I'm also going to share my own experiences as well, navigating the psychiatric industry.
Industry, exactly. Okay. So again, for members, you have access to the second hour. If you're not a member yet and would like to support our work, please go to my website, veilofreality.com, and sign up to the membership. You have access to all the second hours of the podcast where we dive in a lot of more material, which we cannot really share on the public outlets for obvious reasons when you listen to them, or check out the show notes as well if you're interested. And with that being said, see you all in the second hour.